Well, some years back in New York, a guy owned a shoe store, and he decided to do a little experiment here. I don't know that I would have been brave enough to do this, but he did. He took two exactly identical shoes. Same manufacturer, same color, same model, just opened up two identical boxes, and he put them out in the display window in the front of his store. And he put a sign between them, and this is what the sign said. These shoes are identical, only the price is different. I just want to know which price you prefer. This is right on the sign. And the one price was almost double what the other was. So you know what happened, don't you? 3 out of 4 women bought the more expensive. The sign says it's the exact same shoe. But they're sitting there going, it must be a trick. They're trying to pawn these cheaper shoes off on us by telling us that it's the exact same. I'm not going to get fooled. I'm going to get the more expensive ones. Why would they do that? It's human nature. Truth is, guys would have fallen for it just as much because we have this idea in the back of our mind, even if we don't say it out loud, even if we don't think it, in the back of our mind, we always assume that if humanity is putting value on something, that has to be worth pursuing. If the people around us, if society says it's worth more, then it must be worth more. Except when it's not. Except when society gets it wrong. Today, we are going to start our series called Flipped. We're going to look for today and the following 5 Sundays at the Sermon on the Mount. And in the Sermon on the Mount, you have Jesus turning everything that people thought they knew upside down. You have every teaching, every belief that had been instilled in society for 1,000 years, Jesus comes over and he turns it all on its head. And for the next 5 Sundays after today, we're going to look at just some of the things that he taught. We're going to get into some very practical areas. Today is going to be a little more teaching. Today is going to be kind of laying some groundwork. But I hope you can follow along. Today we're going to look at the introduction. This is how Jesus starts it. And there are a couple extremely important things that I hope you leave here today understanding, because it'll help us prepare for the rest of the series as we learn about it. But today we're studying what are called the Beatitudes. How many of you are familiar with that term? I'm assuming a lot will be. Okay, good, quite a few. You'll hear me say it a lot. The Beatitudes are these blessed are statements that Jesus makes. There are 8 of them that are the very introduction to his sermon. I like to use humor. He likes to use Beatitudes. Go figure. I'm not going to complain. He's smarter than I am. But this is how he opens up. And we're going to look at why he opens up this way today and what he says. So let's get into Matthew 5, 1 through 12. And wherever you see underlined words, I always ask you guys to say those out loud with me if you would. Said, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. That is important. We're coming back to that. That means something right here. That tells us something big. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak, and he taught them, saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who came before you. Hey, you suffering people, you're so lucky. Jesus, that doesn't quite make sense. I'm not sure I'm quite tracking with you, Jesus. You're looking at the down and out. You're looking at the ones that the rest of society has written off, and you're saying everyone who looks at you is going to think, man, I want to trade places with them. I want to be in their shoes because, man, they've got it going on. Jesus, I'm not sure that you really understand who you're talking to here. I'm not sure that you really get what you're doing, Lord. Maybe we have to just sit down and have a little conversation. Try to straighten you out a little, Jesus. Or maybe Jesus, throughout the course of this sermon, is going to teach them a whole lot that they didn't understand before. Again, there's some teaching today. So try to bear with me for a few minutes, and this will help understand the rest of the series. Are you guys ready? Okay, first thing is, Jesus went up on a mountain. When we read that, I stopped and I said, that's important. Why? Matthew has a premise. Remember, Matthew, of the four Gospels, was very dedicated to writing to a Jewish audience in a Jewish setting, making sure they would get it in this Jewish context. How did Judaism really dramatically get its start? What is the most pivotal thing of their history is the Exodus, right? Where you have slavery in Egypt, and Moses is sent by God to deliver from slavery. And what is one of the first things Moses does when they're delivered from slavery? He gives them a new law. And where does he give that law? On a mountain. Matthew, throughout his gospel, is establishing that there is a new kingdom here. And this new kingdom is being established by a new Moses. And that new Moses is Jesus. So what he is about to give you in this entire message is the new law. Is literally why Matthew puts that in there, that it was on a mountain. Jesus is the new Moses establishing a new law that will be the center of a new kingdom that will be built. And that is what's about to happen here. But he opens it up, how? With these Beatitudes, where he starts talking to the ones that everyone writes off. Jesus, those are the cheap shoes. Don't you understand? The more expensive ones have to be better. Don't go for the cheap, Jesus. Go for the good ones. Go for the rich, the powerful, those who have it all together. But Jesus doesn't do that. He's inviting the people that you wouldn't expect to be invited. And what does he call them? He calls them in Greek, makarios. Now, this is usually translated in a lot of translations as blessed, and that's frankly a good translation. Some will put fortunate. Fortunate sometimes in American culture has a connotation of you lucky dog, and it's a temporary thing. No, this is more lasting than that. And some of these things, when Jesus says you're blessed, he uses a present tense. Some of them he starts talking about their rewards being in future. He has them both as we read those. You are blessed here and forevermore. A good way to look at makarios might be to flesh it out a little bit more as should be considered fortunate, loved, and cared for by God, that the people around you will look and say, man, that person has a special relationship with God. They are blessed. They are the ones who have it good. But Jesus isn't talking to the ones that everyone around him thought of as blessed. The rich are blessed by God. He established them. He gave them these gifts because he must love them. If you're poor, you must have committed some sort of sin. You must be being punished. But Jesus talks first to the poor, the broken, the mourning. Jesus goes to them with all this because he's establishing a kingdom, but he is not selecting the people that God needs to build this kingdom. He's selecting the people that understand they need him and that they need this kingdom. God doesn't go for those he needs, he goes for those that need him. So all this setup, a little bit more background, and then we'll start to get into the so what of it all. How do we read the Beatitudes? I have spent the last 2 months reading articles and books and things getting ready for today. And I can honestly tell you, I'm more baffled now than I was 2 months ago. If you read 3 experts on the Beatitudes, you will read 4 opinions. These guys can't even agree with themselves, let alone each other. This can be really difficult reading, but there are a few things that all of them seem to get. The Beatitudes are not absolute promises. Sometimes we want to build a doctrine on a verse and set everything up and say, okay, so if I'm meek, I inherit the earth. If I allow myself to get pushed around, then I'll end up really fortunate. Well, I allowed myself to get pushed around and that didn't work out. I guess these Beatitudes are a lie. No, it's not an absolute promise. That's not how ancient literature worked. There was a type of literature very prevalent. Proverbs is this, Ecclesiastes is this. There was what was called wisdom literature, where you would speak in generalities. And what it is it's principles to live by. Not an absolute promise that every time you do, it'll work. But if you live by this overall throughout your life, you'll be glad you did in the end. You'll be makarios. You'll be blessed. And so here's the thing. The other thing scholars agree on is it's an invitation. Jesus is inviting participation in this new kingdom, and we'll spend the rest of the sermon describing what this kingdom looks like. That is the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. And they agree that he is opening up with an invitation, but he is opening it up by turning every expectation upside down. He is opening up with an invitation that would not have made sense if they didn't understand where his heart was and where he was going. Now, how many of you are golf fans? Any golf fans in the area? He had to work, but earlier today, Al stopped by. He's a golf fan, but he had to go to work. So, Scott Stallings, some of you may have heard about this, maybe not. He was a pro golfer. He's on the PGA Tour, won a few tournaments this past year. And so in January, when the invitations went out to participate in the Masters, he thought, I'm getting my invitation. He confessed that one day he checked his mailbox 5 times looking for that invitation, and it wasn't coming. He knew all the Masters invitations had gone out, and he did not get one. And he was very disappointed. He thought for sure he had qualified for this. Well, Scott Stallings is a PGA player. A different Scott Stallings is a realtor who happens to live not very far away. You can see where this is going. This realtor played a little golf here and there, but he was pretty sure he wasn't qualified to be in the Masters tournament, so he was a little confused when he got an invitation. So he managed to get a hold of the other Scott Stallings, and they figured it all out. And Scott Stallings, the PGA player, got to play in the Masters, and Scott Stallings, the realtor, got to go as a part of the gallery there, part of the crowd. And so it all worked out with a happy ending. What would have happened if, when this was realized, the 2 Scott Stallings went to the PGA and the PGA said, no, we want the realtor. We don't want the PGA Tour player. We already know him. We know what we can do. We see something in this realtor. Everyone would think you're crazy. Everyone would think you're nuts. Who would do that? But that's what Jesus is doing in this invitation. He is turning everything upside down. And what does that tell us today? That tells us we don't need to look at the things that the world looks at. We don't need to buy into the things that they always buy into. Because in that day and age, the world said God has rejected the poor. And Jesus looks at him and says, you're poor. You know how to hunger for God. You know how to want more out of life than what you have in front of you. The rich are satisfied. You know how to have a drive to you. People used to think that if you're meek, you're going to be a doormat. How many of you have ever heard a better definition for the word meek? The word meek is somebody who has strength under control. The word meek is a person who has the strength to throw their weight around. They have the position, they have the authority, but they are choosing not to use it. They are choosing not to assert themselves because they think greater glory will come to God by being patient. And Jesus looks at that meek person and he says, Makarios, Your patience will pay off. I can't guarantee it's going to be in the short term, but in the long term, your patience will pay off. And your strength being held back will be rewarded, and you will be better off for it. Oh, the pure in heart, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They're kind of laughed at today, aren't they? I didn't use it in here, but I almost brought in pictures of this pro athlete. She was in the most recent Olympics, 38 years old, I believe, has never married, and has remained chaste during that entire time. And is she laughed at and ridiculed for it? And she's getting so tired of the laughter and so tired of the ridicule. That's what our society does. Oh, back in the 20s, you were a goody two-shoes. Then in the 60s, you were square. When I was growing up, you were a Bible thumper. Now they just look at me and laugh. But our society mocks people who try to live a more traditional value, don't they? Jesus is looking at them saying, you know what, someday it's all going to pay off. You'll be happier. And you know what's interesting is when psychology, when they start doing surveys, these people who live those values tend to be the happiest and most well-adjusted. And Jesus looks at them and says, Makarios, you're blessed, you're fortunate, and others will someday look at you and think, they have it going on. So here are a few simple lessons we can learn from today. Here's the what if, or the so what, of the Beatitudes. Why do I care? Why did you tell me all this, John? A few very, very simple things. Number one, I don't know why it's not advancing. God doesn't only select perfect people. When God's putting together His kingdom, He's not looking for those who have it all together. Deep down, don't we feel like, I'm not ready to come to God, I'm a mess inside, God can't use me? How many of us have ever been there at some point in their life? You know, when I was a youth pastor, we took kids to this weekend Christian concert thing, and we're all sleeping in tents, and first night there, we had this horrible storm come through, and one of the tents got knocked down, and the kids ended up sleeping in the van that night and everything, and the next morning there's mud everywhere, and it's like 101 degrees outside. Some of my kids had the idea to start playing in the mud. We were in the newspaper, a picture of me and one of my girls from the youth group in the newspaper, just head to toe mud. And afterwards, we all decided we better go take a shower, and then we realized we're going to clog the drains on that shower. So we all went swimming in the nearby river to get enough dirt off of us to go take a shower. That is the only time in my life I've ever had to bathe before I could get clean. But how many of us go through the life thinking, I can't get cleaned by Jesus, yet I'm not clean enough? Trust me, His drains can handle anything that you're going to have to clog it with. You do not have to clean up for Him to accept you. He's not looking for perfect people. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite. If you feel that you're that perfect, that you don't need to be cleaned up, you don't feel any need for Him, and He's looking at you saying, I have nothing to work with here. If you don't feel any need for Him, He's not in a place to use you because you're not ready to be led. And sometimes we feel like that person has it all together. God can use them. I'm a mess. God can't use me. God isn't looking for the people that have it all together. He's looking for the people who are ready to be used. Because when we think we have it all together, one, usually we don't. But when we think we have it all together, we trust ourselves too much and not Him. A terrible tragedy happened in 1999. Some of you will remember this when John F. Kennedy Jr. died in a plane crash. His wife and his sister-in-law were both in the plane. All of them were in their upper 30s, and all three lives lost in an instant. It was a very sad thing. But here's the thing. When they did the crash investigation, there was nothing wrong with this plane. So pretty much every expert who looked at the plane crash said he didn't listen to his instruments. Pilots often will say that at about 300 hours of airtime, you have enough confidence to trust yourself too much, but not enough experience to really deserve trusting yourself that much. He had about 300 hours of airtime in. And they think he flew right into the ocean because he wasn't looking at his instruments. He was trusting his gut too much. And that's what happens when we feel sufficient to be used by God. God's saying, you're trusting yourself, you're not trusting me. You're not ready to be used. God doesn't need perfect people. He needs people who are perfectly willing. So the second thing is that when we're hurting, the Beatitudes tell us, turn to God, not away. Turn to Him. He is selecting us. Hurting doesn't mean we are rejected. Hurting doesn't mean that He's done with us. Hurting is part of life. And He looks at the hurting and He says, Makarios, you're ready to let me move in you. Makarios, you're ready to let me bless you. You're hungry for it. I'm not done with you yet. But is that our natural reaction when we hurt? Or is it what C.S. Lewis calls the problem of pain? In our hearts, and I've done this too, don't we end up at times saying, God, you're big, you're powerful, you're all-knowing, and you're not doing a thing. God, you're failing. I don't need you. And we want to walk away. At the worst possible time, when we need Him most, is when we're most likely to walk away from Him. I love being a daddy. You guys saw my little girl here earlier. I have one big fear in life. I'm so tightly wrapped around her finger, I'm afraid of cutting off the circulation. That little girl owns me, and she has from the day she was born. My son, just as bad. Both of my kids, I had that experience that as a dad, my worst moment was when I would take them to the doctor, and the nurse would look at me and say, you hold him down while I give him the shot. You hold him down. I don't even want to be in the room here. No, it's your job, Dad. So I'm holding this kid, trying to put on the brave face, and they're looking at me like, what you doing? Why would you do this? This is not comfortable. I am not liking this, Dad. What are you doing holding me down? Dad, I don't want you holding me right now. Dad, I want out of here. Isn't that what we do with God, though? I wasn't out to hurt my kids. I knew that they didn't like what was happening, but I also knew they needed it. And I hated the way they looked at me, but all I could feel for them was love. When we're hurting, don't walk away from God. He's not done with you. He's not abandoning you. He's not rejecting you. He's holding you. And the third thing, find ways to serve others. This seems odd to me. It seems odd to our hearts, but it's true. The thing we need to do often when we're hurting is look for a positive way to channel that hurt. Now, Reverend Dr. Creighton Kay was the lead pastor at my previous church, and we had a phrase around there, and I'm not sure if he developed this or if he stole it from somewhere else. We pastors are good at stealing. But he may have developed this. He's the only person I've really ever heard use it. We used it a lot in staff behind the scenes. Every now and then he would say it from the pulpit too. He would say, everybody gets to be EGR sometimes. What is EGR? Extra grace required. You ever meet that person who's just a little prickly right now because they're hurting? You know that hurting people sometimes will hurt people. They're ready to snap. They're ready to bite your head off at a moment's notice because they're just wrestling with something inside. I said, yeah, everyone gets a moment to be EGR. You ever meet that person who just feels like, poor me, I'm hurting right now? Everyone gets a moment to be EGR. It's okay that we all have that moment. But then he would go on to say, but you don't get to live there. You can't stay there forever. At some point, you have to say, I'm ready to heal now. At some point, you have to say, I'm ready to move past it. And one of the best ways to do that is to start taking that pain and looking for a way to serve other people, a way to give back. It makes sense of the pain a little bit. It does. But it also gets your eyes off yourself. Well, there's a young lady named Stephanie, and I hesitate to bring this story up, but I'm not going to say anything that she didn't put on her own blog. But Stephanie lives just a little over 2 hours from us right now. She's in her mid-20s, maybe late 20s now. Stephanie, as a young lady, was raised in a Christian home. And Stephanie, in this Christian home, they had a secret. The secret was Dad was an alcoholic, but no one was allowed to know. So every Sunday they would go to church, and they'd smile, and then they'd get home, and Dad would start drinking. Stephanie never knew when she got home from school that day. She wondered, is Dad going to be alive or drunk? Because he would drink himself so silly. Is he going to die one of these days from alcohol poisoning? How long can this go on? And she started to do worse and worse in school. Eventually, she dropped out of school. She dropped out of church. She dropped out of their family, and she just disappeared as best she could. She started living with a guy who was introducing her to drugs. Turns out he was abusive, and her life started to spiral downwards. And it went in that direction for about 5 years. Then one day at 20, Stephanie took a pregnancy test. It was positive. And she knew her life was about to change. And I won't read you her whole story, but let me just read you a few of the things that she put in there. She said, "My pregnancy served as the beginning of my reawakening, though it has also seemed to be my darkest hour. I saw the hell I was surrounded by, and I determined that this just isn't good enough for this baby. Then my son was born, and I stared into his face, the face of a real, live miracle. And then the thought slipped in. Perhaps God hasn't completely forgotten me. After years of silence, He, the Lord, met me there among the willows of my heart." A reference back to the Psalms where Israel's being tormented and they're in captivity. And they're said, hey, sing the happy songs of Zion. And they say, how can we sing the happy songs of Zion when we're in a foreign land? And that's what that willows is a reference to. She continued to write, "I didn't think after all I had done and been that God could use me, but I was so wrong. God impressed me with a passion to sing, speak, and write of my life and His love." She started a ministry where she goes around singing, teaching, speaking at conferences, conventions, and things. And she's touched a lot of lives. And you look at her website and you see some of the testimonials that people wrote in, how she had impacted their lives. But if you think about the words I just read from her story, what she wrote, all of a sudden, I realized God hadn't completely forgotten me. She realized she didn't need to be perfect, didn't she? She says a little bit later on, He met me among the willows of my heart. She realized after 5 years of running from Him, it's time to run towards Him now. And what did she do? She started a ministry, taking her painful story and sharing it with others. She found joy in serving Jesus. And Jesus looked down at Stephanie and He said, "Makarios, people are going to look at you and call you blessed. You've suffered, you've hurt, you've ached, but people are going to look at you and say, that is a child of God, and you're in a place I can use you. You're in a place I can do great things in you, for you, through you." It's never too late. We're going to close with a prayer here. After that prayer, we're going to sing a song. Song is "It Is Well." It's a traditional hymn. Musicians, if you want to start getting in place, feel free. It's a traditional hymn. Carol shared this story recently with me, but if there are some people online, if there are a few of you here who didn't hear it, this was written quite a while ago in the late 1800s by a man named Horatio Spafford. Horatio Spafford was going to go over to England to serve in some revival meetings over there, and at the last minute, he was a real estate lawyer, a deal fell through. He had to stay in a deal with it, so his family went ahead on a ship, and their ship went down. His wife was rescued, but his daughters all drowned. And on the following ship, as he's going across the ocean, the captain showed him the spot where his family was lost, his girls were lost, and it was at that moment that he looked over and he wrote this hymn. And did you guys catch the most beautiful part of this story? This wonderful hymn was written by a lawyer from Chicago. But again, you have a person who says, God, I'm hurting, but you're not done with me. It is well. Musicians.